code pin so we can edit HTML and JavaScript right in the browser without actually having to create files on our desktop. Just by way of demonstration, we'll create an actual project here in 20 minutes or so. But first, let's just take a quick look here in the browser. If at any time this stuff is not big enough, please say something and I'll increase the font size. All right. What's that thing I just made?
That's a paragraph.
Yes. It is a tag representing a paragraph. So that's a tag. What's this? A closing tag. Collectively, what are they? An opening tag and a closing tag. An element, that's right. So a paragraph is an example of an element in the DOM. The DOM is how the browser represents the document that you create with your HTML. So this is a paragraph element. Is it big enough? Cool. So let's put something in there. Extern forever. Now, how could we grab that paragraph using JavaScript? We're going to need to access the DOM. To access the DOM in JavaScript, you type document dot something to get to the DOM. The DOM has a built-in method called query selector. You can use query selector to grab elements out of the DOM using selector syntax, the same selector syntax you use to grab elements in CSS. Anybody know a selector I could use to target that paragraph with CSS? Just P. The simplest possible selector is just by element name. So to query selector, we would pass the string P. I am generally going to use single quotes. There is no functional difference between single quotes and double quotes in JavaScript. It's just a matter of which character you have to escape. If you use a single quote inside a single quoted string, like an apostrophe, you have to use a backslash. Same if you use double quotes inside a double quoted string, but they are functionally equivalent. Most style guides default to single quotes, so that's what we're going to do. So this says grab the first element that is of type P from the page. Similarly, there is query selector all, which finds all matching elements. So whatever the selector is, this will find all matches. Query selector will find the first matching element. So this grabs that paragraph. Groovy. Now what the heck do we do to it? Let's make, well, let's prove that we got it, first of all. Let's open up the console here. And let's save this to a variable. Can we do that? Can we save an element to a variable? Sure we can. So I'm going to say const paragraph. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Const? I thought you said variable. What gives? Well, consts aren't really constants. They're variables that can never be reassigned, which means that I can never then say paragraph equals something entirely differently. Something entirely different. I can manipulate the thing that I saved in that variable, but I can't reassign it with another equal sign, basically. Const and let are new keywords for creating variables that were introduced in ES6 or ES 2015 a few years ago, and they are better than the old way. What's the old way? Var, right?
Can let be reassigned?
Let can be reassigned. You should never use var anymore. Let, as far as you're concerned, most of the time will work the same way. but use const unless you know you need to reassign it, because it can save you from a lot of errors. So the difference between them has to do with scope. So we will talk about that more tomorrow when we really get into function scope. But basically, var just had a lot of issues with scoping. It didn't use lexical scoping like most programming languages use. So let and const were introduced with lexical scoping. Yes? Do we need to have semicolons in JavaScript? Great question. They are optional. It has something called ASI, automatic semicolon insertion. It used to be that you really needed to use them because a lot of times when you go into production, your code will be minified, meaning that something will process the JavaScript and make the file as small as it can possibly be. It'll remove all extra white space, including new lines. And those minification scripts were not smart enough to know where the semicolons actually belonged, and so it would smash things together and it would break. That is no longer the case. The things we use to minify can now handle semicolon-less code just fine. And last year, I made the decision to start omitting the semicolons in class. So I will not be using semicolons. There's nothing wrong with using them. Some style guides do recommend them still. I think React in particular looks a lot better without them, so I'm not going to use them, but you're welcome to. If you do use them, though, use them consistently. So don't, the tricky thing is you have to know where they belong and where they don't. There's certain kinds of expressions that you do not put semicolons after, like function declarations. So if you use them correctly, but they are optional, and I'm not going to be using them in class this year. So all ways of creating variables, and yes, you can save things like an element that you grabbed from the DOM to a variable. Use const unless you know you need to use let, and never use var anymore, and we'll talk about why tomorrow. So let's say console.log paragraph. Let's log the value of our variable to the console. And the console built into this can't handle it. You have to use the browser console instead. Let's see if it shows up here. There it is. There's some other nonsense there. Let's get this to go. Come on. Problem with using the real console in CodePen is there's a lot of CodePen code there too. So here's what the console actually logged. Node list, array looking thing, P. If I used query selector instead of query selector all, we would just get the paragraph. And notice this. When I hover over it in the console, it actually highlights it in the browser. So this little white area is what's actually being rendered by my HTML and JavaScript above. So that is my paragraph. So it seems to have worked. So yeah, query selector all returns an array-like thing containing all the matches. It's technically called a node list, but it behaves very much like an array. So it's a node list with just the one thing in it. We only want the one paragraph, so we're just going to use query selector instead of query selector all. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we're going to talk about those developer tools. Right. Thank you. So, developer tools. On a Mac, it is Option Command J. Learn it, love it, use it. On Windows, that is Shift Control J, or I believe F11. Does that work? Anybody not get it to open up? It may open up on the bottom instead of the side. Doesn't matter. You can change that if you want to. I think using this little menu here, you can say where it goes. So your dev tools. There are many tabs there, one of which is console. We're going to use console for right now. Everybody got it? Cool. So console.log. Every browser supports that. It is actually non-standard, and they don't all work exactly the same way. But it's a pretty good way to just check the value of something real quick to make sure, for example, that a variable contains what you thought it contained. In this case, we confirmed that indeed we have grabbed the paragraph from the page and saved it to a variable called paragraph. So, fat lot of good that does us. So this is an opening tag. This is a closing tag. The whole thing is an element. What if we want to get this text? Everything that's in between the opening and closing tag. What do we call everything between the opening and closing tag of an element? The contents of that element. So what if we want to get the contents of this paragraph? Well, let's play around in the console. Now that we've actually got a paragraph, here I'm going to actually copy and paste this line, see if it works in the real console. Does this work? Holy smokes, it says undefined. Don't freak out. An assignment always returns undefined in JavaScript. One of my least favorite things about JavaScript. It doesn't return the value that you grabbed. It returns undefined. But the variable will still hold the thing. So let's check out paragraph. Sure enough, there's our paragraph. It worked. Now let's find out what we can do with it. Paragraph dot. Oh man, all kinds of stuff. We can see what type it is. It's an HTML paragraph element, which is a type of HTML element. All HTML elements have certain properties and methods on them. Let's look through. See if we see anything good. Man, look at all that stuff, including a bunch of stuff that says on. That sounds interesting. We'll come back to that. All kinds of good stuff. Hey, you know what? This little, oh man, look at all these. Holy smokes. That's a lot of stuff. Ooh, there's tag name. What's that do? Huh, the string P. Who would have guessed? What about the contents? Let's try paragraph dot text content. Totally works. HTML processors can write writing. So this didn't actually get our paragraph. This got a paragraph that's somewhere in CodePen. So the point is we proved that there's a property of paragraphs called text content. Let's see what happens when we use their console. Console log, instead of paragraph, how about paragraph dot text content? Let's see what that does. Just the string extern forever. Cool. I think we can change it using that, or just get it. Let's try. Paragraph dot text content equals. What's for lunch today, Dibble?
Sorry?
What's for lunch today?
I have no clue. Pizza.
Pizza. Look, it says pizza now. Yes, you can both get and set the content of an element using the text content property. Notice it is camel cased. Generally speaking, we camel case things in JavaScript, meaning start with a lowercase letter, new words begin with a capital letter, text content like that. I said there were some unfortunate decisions made very early on in JavaScript's life. Among them, they were not real consistent with the camel casing early on. These days they are. New stuff is camel cased very consistently. Old, dumb methods and properties may not be. Text content, thankfully, is camel cased. So we can get it and we can set it that way. But all this code, all 3 lines, are just going to run as soon as the page loads. So it's going to happen pretty much instantaneously. What's the point of that? That's not much fun. Most of the time, if we're going to add behavior with JavaScript, it's going to happen in response to something else happened. Like this. When one thing happens, do another thing. When an event occurs, react to that event somehow. So let's talk about how to do that. Let's add a new element to our page, a button. What's the HTML element for a button? You'll never guess. It's button. The text that you want to appear in the button, well, that would be the content of the button. In other words, what appears between the opening and closing tags. There we go. So this is silly. Just setting the text content right off the bat. So we have a button now, and we want something to happen when that button is clicked. We'll change the text then and not before. So first, we should grab that button from the page. Tell me a line of code I can write right here to grab that button from the page. What do you say? Oh, what do you say? Grace. I want to grab the button off the page. I already know how to grab this paragraph. It's right there in line 1. On line 2, let's grab the button. How do you think I would do it? Document.querySelector button seems legit. Button is the name of that element. Query selector will find the first one it comes to. There's only one button on the page. Seems like that ought to work. Let's go ahead and save it to a variable. How do I save it to a variable? Pooja. Const button equals document.querySelector button. Seems like that ought to do. Cool. Now, how do we make something happen? When one thing happens, do another thing. When what happens? Some event. So we need to know how to wait for an event to happen and then tell it to do something. There's several ways of doing this, some better than others, some older than others. One old way to do this would be to take the element that the event occurs on. So when we click a button, what element does something happen with? Not the paragraph, right? If we click on the button, it's the button, right? That's where the event will occur. So you may remember in the console we saw that there are a bunch of on somethings. So button.onClick. Just like text content, that is a property of the button. And you can just set that equal to something. The click is the event, and we want something to happen when that event occurs. So the thing that happens when the event occurs is called an event handler. And it must be a function. It's an action that occurs, right? What do we want to happen? Let's change the text of the paragraph. When the button is clicked, run some function to change the paragraph. So let's make this function. How do we make a function in JavaScript? Again, there are several ways, some better than others. The most basic, a function declaration. Let's make a function declaration. The word function, the name we want to give to that function. Change text. How about it? We will name our functions with camel case. Parentheses, any arguments. We don't need any arguments right now. So looks very much like functions in a number of other programming languages. And what do we want it to do? We want this function to change the text of the paragraph. I don't think we need the paragraph outside of this function, so I'm going to move line 1 here that grabs the paragraph to inside the function. So we'll go ahead and move this down too. So now we declare a function, we grab the button. So what should I do inside this function besides grabbing the paragraph? We should change the text, right? How do I do that again? What do you say, TJ? How do I change the contents of that paragraph?
You define a variable, constant.
So we got that paragraph. Now that we have the paragraph, how do I change what the paragraph says? Remember? It's all right. I erased it.
You go to the HTML.
I don't have to change anything in the HTML. I can do this all in JavaScript. What do you say, Jack? So I can log the current content, but if I want to change that content, equal to something. So paragraph dot text content will get the current value, or we can also use that to set a new value. And let's just change it to click. How's that? Up, shows me some kind of error here. Unexpected end of input. Yeah, because we have equal to nothing down here. So what's the idea? You set onClick equal to an actual function. So I could just put change text here. Notice, I am not putting change text open close parentheses. What would that do? It will run the function right then when it hits line 7, and it would assign the return value of that function to the onClick property. So right now, we're not returning anything from up there, so it would be undefined. That function is returning undefined as its value. So if I put the parentheses here, button.onClick would get set to undefined. And the function would run immediately. So we actually want to set the onClick property to the function itself. Functions are first-class objects in JavaScript. You can throw them around like anything else. You can pass them as arguments to other functions. You can set them to variables. I could totally say const do the thing equals change text. Again, without the parentheses. And now do the thing would be a variable that contains the very same function that the other does. Yeah.
So if your function has parameters,
Mm-hmm.
how would you use those without?
That's a great question. We're going to do that in a minute. Great question. So, onClick now equals the function change text. Let's see if it works. It's extern forever. Click me. Now it says click. Totally worked. When one thing happens, do another thing. This is the event, the click. This is the function, the event handler. That's one way to do it, using the onClick property. That is a very old way of doing it, and it is not a very good way because there's some downsides. Sometimes you want more than one thing to happen when the same event occurs. If we then said button.onClick equals something else, we would have just changed the property, and the first event handler would go away. So we have better ways of doing this now. But we saw that it does work. So a new way is to use the built-in DOM method add event listener. So when you're waiting for this event to occur, you're listening for that event. So you add an event listener that waits for that click to occur. So what do you have to tell it? It's a method right on the button, so we know which element we're waiting for something to happen to. It takes two arguments, these two things, the event you're listening for and the handler. So, what event are we listening for? A click. So you just pass it the string click. And then you pass it the function that should run when that click occurs. Which is what? Change text. Again, not the return value of change text, but the function change text itself. We can change this just to make sure we're confident that we're getting our up to date code. Clickety clack. Let's try clicking it. There we go. It worked. So the difference here is that we can add more than one event listener that's listening for the same event on the same DOM element if we wanted to. Totally a thing we could do. What if we had two elements on the page of the same type? How can we be absolutely sure that we get the right one? we might need to use a slightly more specific selector. What's one way we could tell these two apart? Feel free to change the HTML. What's a way we could change this HTML to make it easier to tell those two apart? Yeah. By adding IDs, sure. Oops. ID equals button 1. ID equals button 2. Hey, so this is a tag. This is the element name. This is a closing tag. These are the contents of the element. What do we call ID? An attribute. That's right. These things are attributes. These things with equal signs next to them. And this is the attribute value. So, element name, attribute, attribute value. Okay, great. Now they have IDs. What do I change? How do I grab, say, the second button with query selector? Instead of just button, what can I do to target it by ID? Anybody know CSS selector syntax for an ID? Yep. Hash. So, for example, hash button 2. That will find the element on the page that has that ID. And there should only be one element on the page with an ID. They are meant to be unique. Browsers are very tolerant of your mistakes, so if you put more than one element on a page with an ID, it won't like refuse to render and throw an error. But who knows what will happen in the JavaScript because you did a non-standard thing. What if you had more than one element with the same value? What would you use instead of an ID? A class, right? So we'll get to that in a second. So this would target any element with an ID of button 2. So let's see that. What happens when I click me? Nothing. What happens when I click no, click me? It works. So we targeted a specific button there. So what if, yeah, we could give both of them, say, a class of button or something and an ID of that's unique. Let's add a couple of paragraphs here. Yeah.
What if you wanted to add an event listener to any button on the page? Would that require like a for loop through the node list, or could you do it another way?
Basically, you would have to loop through them. So you could use query selector all to grab all the buttons. And then, since we're not using jQuery, we're using the real DOM, you would have to loop through them and add the event listener to each one of them. Or you could add it to the page and target it by a selector, I think. That might just be a jQuery thing, though. No, I think that works. Like actually add it to the document itself and listen for the event to occur on a certain thing. Okay, now we have 2 paragraphs. This first paragraph, let's give it a class of greeting. Let's give this paragraph a class of question. And this one too. Class is what? An attribute, right? And question is the attribute's value. Say, can I do this without changing anything? Sure I can. The white space will be ignored. Now what if I wanted to change? Well, what happens if I don't change anything? It changed the first one it came to, right? Because we used query selector. What if I wanted to... What if I had another paragraph above this? And I still wanted to target this one. Oops. I still wanted to target hey folks. How could I change this query selector to just target the one with a class of greeting? We know how to target it by ID. We use a hash, right? What about a class? Anybody know? Yes, a period. So I could say dot greeting. What if I also had an H1 with a class of greeting? What's it going to do? It changed the H1, right? What if I wanted to be sure that it changed the paragraph? I not only want to target something with a class of greeting, but I specifically want a paragraph with a class of greeting, not an H1 with a class of greeting. Yeah, you can combine an element name selector and a class selector by saying p.greeting. No space between the two. That means find me a paragraph with a class of greeting. Try it. Yep. Totally works. Now that's an awful lot on the page. What if, instead of using a button, we wanted to change the element you clicked on? What? Well, heck, what if we just wanted to change the button? Let's get rid of some stuff. Say again? So we could grab the button and change its text content, right? What if I wanted to be sure that it was the button I clicked on? I didn't want to just grab it by element name because I didn't know what it was going to be, maybe. I just wanted to change the content of whatever button I clicked on. Okay, add it as an argument. That's an idea. It seems like there's got to be, this. Getting tricky. True. We'll talk more about this on another day. This is your nightmare, but you will learn to master it. But he's on to something there. There's got to be some way in JavaScript to find out what thing you clicked, right? There's just got to be a way. Let's see what we can do. I want to stick myself inside this function when it runs. I better change this because I got rid of button 2. Let's put a breakpoint in there. Ever use breakpoints in debuggers? In JavaScript, you can just put the word debugger right in there. And now when that function runs, it will pause execution right at that line. This doesn't work super well inside CodePen, but we'll give it a shot. See what happens. Click me, paused in debugger. Here I am. If I click over to the console, now I should be inside this function. What is this? It's the button. He's right. But we're not going to use that method. We're going to use a different one. We're going to learn more about this later. But yes, this totally gives you the button. What about arguments getting passed into here? Interesting thing about JavaScript, it does not enforce the number or type of arguments that you pass. You can always pass more than it asks for, and you can always pass fewer than it asks for. And it can pass something along that you didn't ask for. Can't remember, is it called parameters? I think it's called parameters. No, arguments. There it is. Arguments. We'll show you the arguments to the function, even if you didn't assign name to them. And you can see there is one, a mouse event. So that's being passed in whether we asked for it or not. A mouse event. So this thing, the event that occurred, will always get passed in as an argument to the function you use to handle it, whether you want it to or not. So if we assign a name to it over here, let's go ahead and unpause our debugger. Let's throw EV in here, since we know it's an event. And let's try again. Flip back over to my console when I hit the debugger. Hit EV. And EV is our mouse event. Cool. And that thing has all kinds of properties. One of which is called target, which it appears is our button. So the event target is the element on which the event occurred. So if it's a button that got clicked, the event target will be the button. So since we saved the event to a variable called EV, we could type ev.target to get the button. So once we have the button, we can do things like change its text content, right? So let's try that. ev.target.text content equals click. Think it'll work? It did. Neat. Let's talk a little more about functions for just a minute. So we mentioned you can pass a function as an argument to another function. No problem. And we mentioned that functions can be assigned to variables just like anything else. As a matter of fact, you can make anonymous functions. Don't even give it a name. Just say function, parameter list, and define the thing. And then you could say, for example, const, change text, and set that variable equal to this anonymous function. And this will work the same way. There's a subtle difference between the two ways, but we won't get into that today. Still works. So, if we can have anonymous functions, what if it's, well, let's show an example here. I could say console.log howdy. I could also say const str equals howdy and console.log that variable, right? Same thing. You could do just the value, or you could save that value to a variable and log that. Same thing. So, could you, instead of saving this function to a variable and passing that in, what if you just wrote the function right there? You can put a string right there inside the parentheses, right? Could you just write the function there? Could I do this? Actually write the function inside the parentheses. So this is, again, an anonymous function, one that we haven't given a name to. Does it work? Totally works. Little hard to read that way, but you can absolutely do it because functions are just values like strings or numbers or anything else. So you could, just like you can just put the string click in here, you don't have to say const event equals the string click and say event. You could. You could also just write the string right there inside parentheses. You can totally do the same thing with a value, with a function. You don't have to save it to a variable first. You don't have to give it a name. You can just write a function expression right inside parentheses. Sooner or later, we're going to want to do this. Right now, it probably just makes it a little hard to read. But there it is. All right, so that's our CodePen example. Next, we're going to actually do a thing inside our editors. Questions so far? Yeah. No, JavaScript is an untyped language, basically, a loosely typed language. You do not need to specify a type. It's never going to check. Yeah.
Does it have to be a function for the second parameter or something being anything else?
The second argument to add event listener always needs to be a function because you have to tell it when something occurs, do something else. And the do something else has to be a function because what happens, since again, we don't pass in the parentheses, what happens is it's going to execute that function later. When the click actually happens, JavaScript's going to execute that function for you. So it's essentially going to stick those parentheses on there. So if you pass it something other than a function, it's not going to know what the heck to do with that. You're probably going to get an error that says such and such is not a function. Yeah. W, right? Ashwin. It has a W in it. Okay. Ashwin.
So that EV is a mouse event, right?
In this case, yeah.
How is that being passed, or how is that being passed to that?
Okay. Let's change it back to the non-anonymous version just because it's a little easier to follow. So we wrote our function to accept an argument. But we don't run this thing ourselves, right? We don't run change text and pass something in. We just add it as an event listener. And JavaScript does the actual execution. And when a function is working as an event handler, when JavaScript automatically runs that for you when the click occurs, it is always going to pass that event as an argument to it. So it's going to do that whether you ask for it or not. That's just something JavaScript does internally. It always passes the event. If it's a form submission, it'll be a form submission event. If it's a mouse move or something, it'll be that. So whatever kind of event it is, it's always going to pass that as an argument to your handler for you. You can pass other arguments yourself, which we're going to do in the next example. That's always, well, is it the first or the last? I think it might be the last, actually. We will find out later because we're going to do it. Okay? Groovy.